university, well, from New South Wales. I hear on the news this morning, Simon, you've got a huge plague of mice in New South Wales, driving all the farmers crazy.
We do, and us city folk didn't mind too much until we were told they're on their way to the city. So now we're sitting up and taking notice. We're getting our cricket bats out and we're ready to do what needs to be done.
Gosh, that is not so good. So welcome and thank you for joining us yet again. Simon was with us in November and hosted an amazing session on reimagining and building back better. Today, we're going to be really much more focused on some work that Simon's been doing on a program that he has through his Agile School Leadership Program and all across the world, actually, on teaching sprints. The new book that came out this year, I'll show you. I have to say I'm a bit ashamed it's in a bit of a tatty state, Simon, but that means it's not just been sitting on my bookshelf, which is always good news. So for those of you who don't know Simon terribly well, Simon's a research fellow at the Gonski Institute in the University of New South Wales, and he has an Agile School Leadership Program that runs widely. His teaching sprints is used globally, and he's also a government advisor in various places. And my connection originally with Simon is through the Ontario Principals Council, as he's on their consultancy boards. So we are delighted to have Simon with us again this morning. I'm going to start, Simon, before I let you loose, with a little quote from the Teaching Sprints book, because I read it and I thought, do you know, if we could get that right, we'd have the world sorted in education terms. How can we enable overloaded teachers to keep getting better at their craft? How can we build an effective and simple approach to school-based professional learning? And for me, that's at the heart of everything we're trying to do. And so to have the opportunity to have that conversation with you this morning is just great. So without any further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Simon and sit back and enjoy the session.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I so appreciate you putting aside a bit of time, whether you're at your desk or at home with a cup of coffee or tea. I'm thrilled to have this chance to think a little bit, not so much about COVID, actually, not so much about building back better, but actually on the core work of how we as school leaders can support the adults that work in our buildings to keep getting better at their craft. And I want to acknowledge that in some ways, no one wants to talk about practice improvement right now. I hear the clock is running with about 4 weeks left until holidays. Maybe as I'm tracking along here, you could drop in something here into the chat bar. What are you most looking forward to doing during this holiday break? And I know for so many, we've got our eyes on that prize of closing out the year, keeping people safe. And I understand our poor secondary colleagues are having to do a whole range of different assessments to bring everything together. And so my big message to begin with is just to say, thanks for what you've done. It's incredible what you've navigated, and do what you can to see out this year well, and then head on into a well-earned break. But I do want to add a little bit of a PS to that. And that is, it really does help us in the new year, and hopefully a high vaccination rate, fresh start new year, to begin a very small amount of thinking now about how we want to support our educators on the other side. And I know you'll be receiving lots of great advice about well-being, about supporting our colleagues, and especially given that the impact and effects of much of what they've navigated may not even come out for many months ahead. But I do want to say that one of the ways that we serve and we support our adults in the room is not just to reduce the pressure, which of course we need to consider, but also to give people opportunities for mastery, for growth, and for progress. It might seem a bit counterintuitive, but I want to make the argument today that as we return to something closer to a new normal, and as we get back into the work of more consistent teaching and learning, one of the most beneficial things you can give busy people is a chance to return to the craft that they love, engage with some fresh thinking in a simple and effective way, and have an opportunity to develop greater levels of mastery. Because teaching is a profession that many people do, not just for a few years, but many do it for a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades and more. And what's great about teaching is it's so complex and it's relational. And look, you could work on it for 30 years, and 30-year veterans sometimes say to me, I'm just starting to get the hang of this craft. But there's also a sense in education where, outside of the push factors that we experienced through COVID, and I want to acknowledge the incredible speed at which people were skilling up and adjusting. But when some of those push factors are gone, and when we return back to schooling in a steady state, all of us as school leaders have to think about, how are we going to help our educators to keep enhancing their craft? How do we give them that joyous experience of getting better? And how do we help them spend the very limited amount of time that they have in school-based professional learning, doing that in such a way that gets cut through for their learners? And that's really what I'd love to spend the next 40 minutes or so just exploring together. Please feel no pressure at all to do something now, but to think about how on the other side of summer and on the other side of the worst part of this pandemic, you might want to come back with school-based professional learning that is both really rigorous in its evidence base, but it's also human. It allows people to work even when they feel a bit overloaded and overwhelmed. Almost all of my work as an applied researcher starts with problems that come from the field. When I'm working shoulder to shoulder with school leaders, I'm always looking and listening up to what are the persistent problems of practice that they're trying to work through. And a few years ago now, when I was working with school leaders around school improvement, many of them were saying, Simon, I really do want to work on areas of school-based professional learning. They were convinced of the evidence that you're not going to get sustained practice change by just sending people off to conferences and courses. That, to use a full expression, you've got to learn the work by doing the work in the context in which you work, with the people with which you work. There's not much evidence of high levels of transfer, of teacher practice change occurring because I learned something at some workshop and I can bring that back and translate it. No, it seems as though you've got to do the work where you do the work, and you've got to learn how to make that evidence work in your context. And so they were saying, we want to do school-based professional learning, but we've got a bit of a problem. We're getting people together in teams, we're structuring the time, but we're not having a lot of impact from that time. There's not a lot of rigor, to be honest. People are cathartically debriefing on whatever's occurred. They might have a little look at data or have a bit of conversation about research, but there's no real sense that that's turning into sustained practice change. On the other side, people were saying to me, Simon, there's this other tension around we want more rigor, but people feel overloaded. And practice improvement kept falling off the agenda. Of course, during a global pandemic, no one's thinking at the end of the week on a Friday, have I done enough practice improvement? But even during a busy non-pandemic week, back in the good old days of just exhausted 50-hour, 55-hour weeks, well, even then, the thing about practice improvement is that if I put it off today, it doesn't really matter, does it? And if I put it off this term, well, it's been a really busy term and I've had reporting and assessing, and practice improvement is never urgent, particularly for those of us who are overloaded. And the danger for that is that the evidence suggests after about 5 to 6 years, many of us in the profession start to reach a premature plateau of good enough. And so the tension that I've been trying to explore in the Teaching Sprints work is a tension that is about, how do we help overloaded educators keep getting better at their craft? And so that is what I want to explore together today. I just want to note that someone here has just said they keep getting kicked out. That's not me, I promise. You didn't say anything mean or anything else. If you just want to let us know in the chat bar as well, if anyone else is having any problems with the technology, would love to know that, just so we can adjust within the powers that we have. So I'm going to share my screen here. As Annette mentioned, that means that I can't see a thing anymore because I can't share through my iPad. Google's not letting me. Annette, can you see that okay?
Yes, it's coming up now. Thanks, Simon. Clear as day.
Thank you for relieving my fear. So let me share a little bit about this applied work I've been doing. And from the outset, I just want you to know, I'm not asking you to do teaching sprints. I'm never asking you to buy any product. Everything you need is freely available online, or if you've got 20 bucks, you can buy the Corwin book. I don't make any money out of a book, but it's a pretty simple guide. I really don't want to pitch you on a process today. I want to talk to you about how I think about this problem. And then out of that, I just wonder whether or not you might want to take some ideas into your summertime thinking about school-embedded professional learning. So the first thing to say is that teaching sprints is all about teacher learning, okay? It's not about anything other than about helping our adults make progress in their craft and enhance their adaptive expertise. And, you know, it's worth asking yourself, and you might say, look, we're in kind of survival mode right now, Simon, but, you know, you start to think about your school improvement plans over the years and maybe what you might want to do in the coming year. And you say, well, what specific evidence-informed practices do teachers need to enhance in order for my school to achieve its improvement aspirations? Sometimes these are specific things like enhancement of feedback or enhancement of formative assessment, or the use of retrieval practice and spaced review, or improving the quality of questioning, or modeling metacognitive thinking. I mean, many of us globally in the English-speaking world are working on the same things. Perhaps other areas might be domain specific. Simon, we're really working on reading, and we're really working on this part of reading. We're trying to help our educators understand the science of reading around phonological awareness, and phonemic awareness, and how that moves into fluency, and have a set of practices that are powerful in that area. Or the explicit teaching of vocabulary. Or maybe it's in mathematics and you're really interested in evidence-informed practices around the teaching of, I don't know, the areas that every school I ever work with has problems. Place value, fractions, multiplicative thinking, these areas that are essential to learn but hard to teach. And so I want to say so many of our school-wide and even Scotland-wide aspirations are tied up with helping ourselves and our colleagues step into evidence-informed practices. And that's why this driving kind of research question has really been pushing there over the last basically half decade. You know, how do we take those overloaded educators, us, and how do we help us keep enhancing our craft in a way that's informed by the evidence? And I've been working on an approach that tries to get around these issues, because we have to acknowledge everything we read, and in the anecdotal feedback we get from teachers, they rightly say, I'm overloaded, I'm overwhelmed, and I never get to the end of the week thinking, what shall I do with my spare hours? So as leaders of learning and leaders of adult learning, we've got to take seriously the limitations, the cognitive and emotional limitations of our people. And we also have to have empathy for the fact that if you are flat out and you're exhausted, it's really quite logical for our teachers to focus their energies, not on the new stuff, but on getting the job done, rather than working on getting better at how they do the job. I've got 3 young kids. I love them, especially when I'm traveling. No, just joking. I don't travel much anymore. But I've got now a 7-year-old. My eldest turned 7 last Wednesday. I've got a 6-year-old and I've got a 3-year-old. And my wife and I, you know, we're always just trying to survive the week. Who's doing drop-off? Who's doing pickup? She's working at elementary school a few days a week now. I'm doing my work. And can you imagine if I got to the end of the week and I said, honey, can we sit down? And she's like, oh, great, we've got a moment. Let's plan out next week. Let's get the meal plan. Who's doing the lunches? Like, no, I didn't want to talk about getting the parenting work done. I wanted to spend some time about how we could get better at the parenting work. I don't want you to show me, and I'm glad you got your videos off, but maybe you could show me the finger you think my wife might communicate back to me if I suggested that. You know, when you're flat out and you're exhausted and someone says, hey, no, we're not spending this time doing the work. We're spending this time stepping back and getting better at the work. It's so hard for us to see through and to actually step away and do that work. And so that's why in all areas of human endeavor, we have a tendency towards leveling out at good enough. Where we start to develop real fluency in our practice, it becomes easier to do, but we're not yet necessarily getting to higher levels of mastery. A good example of this might be, what is your default meal that you cook? What is a default meal that you cook? And maybe I'm just coming out here so I can see. Can you drop in for me here into the chat bar? What is a default meal that you cook? Can you just drop that into the chat bar for me? Thank you, Wendy. Appreciate it. John's in with the fish pie. Julie's on the pasta. risotto, macaroni, oh, this is lovely diversity. Chili, pasta and pesto. Here we go, chili. Well, olives and bread. Bev, is that a meal? Like, no judgment, but I still like it. These are all good things. And so what I want to say is once you start, colleagues, once you start getting real fluency at something, my guess is your default meal doesn't taste much better than it would have a few years ago. Because what's happened is you've developed such fluency is that you cook your default meal when your brain and everything else is thinking about other things. So this is about that leveling out at good enough. And what we need to do in our personal lives, in our cooking lives, is to sort of work out, well, how do I not just keep cooking the same thing at the level that I currently do? How do we make a step change and get to higher levels of mastery? And I think something similar occurs in our pedagogical practices once we've been teaching for 3 or 4 years. That what can happen is that we can develop real fluency, almost feel like we're an autopilot. But that fluency doesn't mean higher levels of impact. It actually means that it's just easier for us to do. And what our jobs, I think, as leaders of practice improvement and leaders in our schools is to acknowledge that that's a natural tendency. It doesn't mean anything about the person's professionalism, in my mind, mindsets and everything else. I just think they're wasted pathways. What I'm really interested instead is to say, how could we design school-embedded professional learning that helps good people like us who have a tendency to flatline, who have a tendency to, flatline out at good enough to keep making progress. And so what I want to show you is what I've been learning about how to do that. So this is the very simple process that I want to talk you through a little bit today. It's my effort to give school leaders something super basic that every educator can use to enhance their practice, even when they're overloaded. The simplicity has been hard to get to. You might look at this and say, Simon, that's not rocket surgery. And I agree, but simplicity is hard to get to. It's hard to make something simple. And I want to share a little bit about this process and how it's built on some big ideas about how teachers get better at their work. We've been testing this with hundreds and hundreds of schools and thousands of educators, and teachers have told us what's worked and what hasn't worked, what they've been able to actually try out and what they haven't. And so now we've got a really nice, I think, adaptable process. And by that, I mean, you can take bits of this, you can play around with it. You don't even have to call it teaching sprints. I don't care. I have lots of schools who just use it as their practice improvement process. They say, we don't like the word teaching sprints. And I say, I get it. I kind of both love it and hate it. It's not about the name. It's about understanding what the work is. And so what I really care about in this half an hour is for you to be thinking not so much about, am I going to use this thing that this outsider with a bad accent is telling me about? No, I'm really interested in how you as a school leader think about practice improvement and how to get better. And whether or not what you've got on the ground going into a fresh year, whether it's some type of professional learning community, PLC, or a teacher learning community, or some sort of teacher learning teams, do you have a process within that structure that's actually going to get cut through on the other side of this period? So if you are interested in any of this, I'll say again that everything you need is on the website. If you just type that in, teachingsprints.com, it'll be useful for you to have as I walk through this content. So you can kind of see, good, I got everything I need. There's the process, there's the research, there's the tools he talked about. I could send this as an email even to some of my middle level leaders right now. They really need a process like this to lead team learning, and everything you need is freely available up there. So let me share a couple of ideas, and thanks A. Weatherston for sharing that link. I appreciate it. So first ideas. Well, before you look at the process, I just want to share 3 really big ideas and important ideas about taking a sprints approach to improvement. And these are the 3 ideas. The first one is the behavioral sciences are pretty clear that when people are overloaded and overworked, the core goal is not to try to motivate them. The core goal is to shrink the size of the task. This is a breakthrough finding, I think, for school leaders who constantly find themselves trying to get cut through by changing other adults' mindsets and beliefs. It's much better off, actually, to not focus on mindsets and motivation, but to help people work on small, manageable pieces of work. The second big idea is about starting with the best bets. And this is to say that I've learned when I get teachers together and they're just sharing ideas with each other, sometimes they can be sharing ideas that, to be honest, aren't based on the best available evidence. It's like me sharing my recipe for, I don't know, chili that came up 5 times, and we're all just sharing our recipes. But so much is just sharing our opinions unless we have some sort of evidence base that what we're doing is actually having an impact and having a greater impact than what people are already doing. So in my mind, professional learning should start with the best bets from the research evidence. And I'm just thrilled to be able to let you know that the world has changed dramatically in the last 3 to 4 years. That we as educators now have access to not just some robust evidence, but robust and relevant, clearly written translations from robust sources that don't cost any money that we can use to inform our professional learning. And the third idea here is that actually professional learning has often not been very effective because we focus too much on the knowledge building, but we haven't got into the practicing. So just very briefly, again, thinking about, please, your current professional learning structures. And maybe you say, look, it's all COVID right now. It's kind of our responses to that. But maybe think pre-2020, what you had and what you probably will return to on the other side of summer, unless you start to design something that's more powerful. I want to say that we've often asked educators to try to change too much, and they've ended up like in some sort of version of pedagogical dieting, where they make a small change for a little bit of time. And what I've learned is that we can take a small incremental approach. We can build up over time, one small step. And if we help them do it in a sustainable way, they can sustain it and move to the next one. The second big idea here is start with the best bets from research. Of course, a lot of teachers have felt alienated from research. It feels like things that they don't really have good access to. But now increasingly we have wonderful resources that we can engage with, small little bite-sized pieces of research. And research will never tell a Scottish teacher what he or she must do right now in the classroom. We're coming up to the start of the school day. I don't know what the research means for exactly what your teachers should do at 9:01 this morning, but I do know it gives us the best bets, the things that on average have worked in the past well, and we should be turning to that. If we've only got a limited amount of time and people are tired, why would we waste any of our professional learning time on something that doesn't have good evidence? And that third idea, that third and final idea, is that we need to enhance the role of practicing. Now, we still use practicing with an S here in Australia. I hope you haven't given it up as well. The Americans just got too confused about when to use the C and when to use the S. But it's about practice makes progress. And what we're talking about here is we've learned a lot about effective practice. We've learned a lot about it. And there's a whole literature on expertise development and how we as humans, not just as teachers, but as humans, enhance our expertise. And it normally involves trying to identify something that's beyond our current comfort zone, choosing something that's highly specific. I want to work on this. You don't work on your whole craft. You don't work on all of your surgery. You don't work on all of your games. You don't work on all of your scales. You work on certain things and you isolate that to get better at it. Then you've actually got to practice. This is unfortunate. My poor little 7-year-old, I signed him up for piano lessons. He doesn't mind going on a Wednesday afternoon for a little 20-minute piano lesson, but he's quite annoyed that I have some expectation that if he goes to the piano lesson, he has to practice between the lessons. He says, well, I play piano with my teacher. I say, that's not practice. That's getting expert feedback to guide your next round of practice. And I'm sure others out there have had the same frustration as a parent where you're paying for something, but actually the practice doesn't happen. So the growth doesn't happen in the lesson. The growth happens between the lessons in the practicing. And there's so too with your professional learning communities, with your teams, with your professional learning sessions, with your instructional coaching. You've got to know that nothing gets better by just going to those. That is where we get expert input and feedback. And then we have to go and practice within our own classrooms to make progress. So let me just give you here just 2 minutes, too short, but just pick one of those big ideas and just reflect on your current, or again, maybe more like 2019 and then what you're likely to return to post-summer, on your current approaches to professional learning. I'll just give you a moment to reflect on one of those questions. And if you feel game, drop something into the chat bar. You're also welcome to tweet me if you want.
Simon, I just love that notion of the sort of explicit and intentional link to improving practice, and that sort of moves things forward. And I know it's certainly something we've been talking about over here. So it's really nice to have that sort of deepened in terms of what we're thinking about today.
Oh, I appreciate it. I'm so glad it's landing for you and connecting to the conversations that you might be having. I'm a bit controversial here. I failed more often than you because I've run professional learning across probably more sites, more schools. And, you know, one of the things I've learned is if you just get teachers together with time and say, oh, what's that inquiry question you'd like to pursue? And what are you interested in? And what have you been looking at? It all sounded great. And I was a big believer in that. But I just don't see it work on the ground when people are tired. That too often, other than the great volunteer groups, 10 weeks in, teachers are still working out their hunch or what they're going to work on. And in the end, so many of them then get frustrated and see professional learning as just a time for a chat or a share, rather than something that's about really getting growth and progress that they can see visibly over a short period of time.
Yeah, and we've got Wendy adding in that this is helping her to understand why things haven't made the improvements that she would like to see in the chat pane. So yeah, I think it's that coming together of that understanding, isn't it? That it's eating the elephant, you know, that wee bit at a time. And it's the same with this, those tiny shifts and nudging. And we've got Miriam McDonald saying, peer reflective conversations can be a really safe place for colleagues to feel safe about change. Good place to try things out regularly and take risks.
Awesome. 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 All right. Thank you for your help here, because I can't see both because I'm locked out of my own computer when I'm presenting here. But colleagues, just stay with me here, because there's a sense where I'm trying to lay down an argument, and I don't want you to say, I want to do teaching sprints or not. That's a low level response. I want to respectfully say too often we think, oh, do I want that solution? I don't want you to take this solution. I want you to understand my thinking, how I've tried to try things out, and then I've landed on a set of ideas that now guide what I think works in the majority of schools. Not in a few schools, not with just a little volunteer group of teachers. I'm sick and tired of having examples of professional learning that's going well where people point to one team who do this amazing project. I was like, well, that's just lifting the ceiling of practice, and that's great, but school leaders need to secure the floor. We need an approach that's going to work for every busy educator, even those who, to be honest, are giving you a bit of resistance and pushback. So let me show you the approach in action. Remember, take whatever you want, discard what you don't like. How do those three ideas come into reality? And this is the little process: prepare, sprint, review. It's taken me years to make it this simple. No teacher remembers 7 to 9 steps in their inquiry process for learning. I'm sorry, but they can't even remember 3 or 4 things on a shopping list they've got to do after school. So what I want to suggest is the simplicity. Also, I think the process should come to a meaningful completion about the end of every school term. It's very hard for teachers to close out and then find through lines after holiday breaks and then pick up where they left off. I find most teams after 2 or 3 terms, if it's all the same merging project, you get a high failure rate of teachers going, I'm really not sure what we're meant to be doing now. So short, sharp, focused, visible progress, easy to do. And this is all based on the behavioral science research around how do you help adults change what they do. So there's 3 phases. And when I take you through these phases and the tools I've produced to make them easy, I want you to think about 3 types of adult or teacher learning. So the prepare phase is all about knowledge building. It's about evidence-informed knowledge building and disciplined dialogue. We want new inputs to interrupt the well-worn grooves of conversations, and we want to dialogue and discuss with each other about what does this mean, and does this have any sort of influence on what I might do in the classroom? So prepare is about knowledge building, and it's sort of thinking about its connections back to our own practice. The sprint is the practicing phase, and if you don't like the word sprint, just call it practice. That's fine. It's our practicing phase where we do intentional practicing in classrooms. We're trying out this idea in the context of our own classroom. We're trying to make what works from the research actually work in our classroom and experience the joy of just tinkering and playing with our craft around one thing at a time. Review is all about collegial reflection, determining implications for future practice, and thinking about, well, given what I've been through, what do I want to do next? So we won't do this now necessarily, but I wouldn't mind. Let me hit some of these in your beautiful questions that are coming through. But I just want to, in the Teaching Sprints website here, team, could you just press on the first tab that says process? And I'm just slowly here going to find that. And maybe you want to just drop this in. And you can download and have a little look at this process. But it's designed to be super simple that everyone just in one read can kind of get it. Prepare, sprint, review. You're going to understand, roughly what to do. Prepare is really easy. All you're doing in prepare is you're coming together to determine a practice improvement focus. The sprint is over 2 to 4 weeks, no longer than that. Otherwise, people just forget and they don't start. You're going to intentionally try something out, and then you're going to come around and review. And so the simplicity of this, and you could even look at your current professional learning process and even just tick off, which of those sub-steps do you kind of do? You may not call it what I call it, but which ones do you do? And which ones, honestly, do you not have? And what impact does it have to not have that piece? So let me walk you through this very simple process, and you can have a look later on. I'm going to pause after each step, and Annette, I'll have a quick look at the questions with you, and I'll respond. So prepare. Prepare is about coming together to determine a focus for practice improvement. Normally this happens in small teams, but I see all different things happening. Sometimes you could use it in an instructional coaching, one-on-one or 1-to-2. Sometimes these are teams coming together. And that bottom picture is a bit weird, isn't it? Remember when we used to do that? Well, that was February 2020, actually, before everything locked down. I had schools across a whole network of schools coming together, and we were planning our sprints together. And so you can do this in any type of format. And obviously, you can do it online as well until you're back in person doing professional learning all the time the way you used to. And I want to say that the sprints approach is a research mobilization professional learning. So we always, wherever possible, start with some new evidence. And this has been tough for us over time because rightly people say, well, where's the evidence, Simon? And I say, well, who am I to have to, I've got a process, and use the process, and you use what evidence is available in your school or system. Well, I decided I couldn't fudge anymore, and I needed to make it easier. And so when we think about this work on our website, you'll find 2 starting points of how to get in and get moving with some research that you could start working on. Now, I acknowledge you may not be able to find research on every one of your questions. And here's what's controversial. I wouldn't spend any professional learning time on any practice improvement area that you don't have good evidence-informed bets on. I really wouldn't. I would wait and I would work on things that we already know are incredibly important and we have a good research on. Get people to work on those. Whilst you as a leadership team maybe work with a small cluster of teachers to try to work out what are the best bets in the area we're working on. It is a very low efficiency strategy to get a whole school to inquire their way into improvement in an area without underlying evidence to support their early moves. We don't ask nurses to do that. We don't ask physios to do that. We don't ask general practitioners to do it because it's a very slow way to generate new evidence. Much better off, I think, in limited time, working through the things where we already have strong evidence. And then if there are things we really are trying to solve, pull a small number of people together, build some partnerships with universities or trusted others, and start to work out what are the research-informed things that we could work on, rather than just throwing that out to our whole staff. Now, that's quite a controversial opinion, perhaps, but I'm coming from a pragmatic lens. I think teachers are probably only going to have time to deliberately get better at one core practice every school term. So some might want to do more. Yeah, but most every term deliberately and sustainably getting better at one thing. And I never want them to waste one of those terms of improvement on something that we don't really have good guidance on what they should be working on. So to try to solve the pushback that I rightly received from teachers, where they said, well, what research? We've tried to gather research in 2 areas. The simplest one, as you'll see on our Sprint Starters tab, is a set of small little videos. They're about 4 to 7 minutes. And these are really great starting points. You say, Simon, we want to do a little mini sprint in the next couple of weeks. We're too excited about this. I don't know whether it's the accent or the process, but you can't hold us back. We want to do one. Well, who would I be to stand in your way? And so you could just jump on this literally with 2 teachers, say which one of these are interesting, and you could be off and away doing a little playful sprint in even the closing weeks of this year. For most of you, of course, it'll be a next year thing, but that'll be fun because at least you'll know that really easily you could get into this. I love the work of Tom Sherrington, a great former head teacher and consultant and thinker. I love his walkthrough books. We're big fans and partners with him in that work. We even had him speak at our Teaching Sprint Summit recently. His work on Rosenshine's principles, I think, is just clear, evidence-informed, and just helps educators get moving. So we've got him to do a series of these short little videos on some really clear evidence-informed practices. The great man himself, Professor Dylan William, kindly did a few for us. I don't know why we didn't get one of his funky ties, but maybe we had to pay premium for that and we didn't know. But again, people want to work with Dylan, and I'd recommend you do work with his materials, his embedded formative assessment book. But what happens if you just wanted people to get moving? Just get moving. So you've got over 10 little starters. And to be honest, a lot of high schools, secondary schools, you can do 2 years of sprints and never get off this page. There is enough there to get moving and get on with it. So again, maybe you'll come back through this later on and if we had more time. But think about if there's any starters on our list that you reckon you could use and drop that into the chat bar for me. We've also got a little research hub. You just click on the research tab. And there's a whole range of links there that we slowly build up around areas that we find most schools want to work on at some point. And so we love getting teaching sprints to focus on Rosenshine's principles of instruction. Maybe you'd like to do teaching sprints on space practice and retrieval practice, 2 key findings from cognitive science that I wish I had have known when I was training to be a science teacher. I mentioned before working on formative assessment. We really recommend basing it on Dylan's work. Maybe you want to engage with cognitive load theory from John Sweller's work and start to think a little bit about the implications for how we teach and how we actually help students to secure memory. Many people want to work on feedback and they spend all this money getting people to deliver workshops on things that, to be honest, all that content is already open. Stop spending money on the what. The key is to get a mechanism for the implementation and the mobilization. Other things people work on, all the links are up on our website, enhancing metacognition and self-regulation, and a great report from the Education Endowment Foundation. And all of that is supported by a couple of protocols you can use: Research Jigsaw, Learn and Let Go, and other ones that are online, clear instructions that you could use to run your prepare meeting. So I might pause there just briefly and say, okay, so it's a pretty simple step. We want you to engage with some research, have some good dialogue using our tools, and then just decide on one thing you'd like to work on. So I might pause here and just have a look at any quick questions that are coming through.
Simon, we've had just a couple of comments, really. Jill and Woody saying they've tried to create additional time within the school day to learn together by using supply time to buy in, to learn together and then practice what we learn and share. So somebody who's on it at the moment, and I'm sure there'll be others coming in. Yeah,
I see that, and that's fantastic. You know, the main thing here, and this is a bit controversial, is I'll quote the great Michael Fullan again. He says, collaboration as an end in of itself is a waste of time. You know, the sense that we don't want to just get people together. And I can see, I love your focus on the learning, Julie. I love that you're saying I've bought time so we can learn together. And what I want to say is that, unfortunately, when adults get together, practice improvement isn't the natural state of things. And so we need to buy time and then drop in a process, a clear process that's an expertise development process. 50 minutes you've bought out. I've bought it. Okay, great. Now, I want you to read a core article, talk about it together, decide on one thing to practice, and then off and away and you're going. And you're going to go and practice around low stakes quizzing about retrieval practice. You're going to use hinge questions from Dylan Williams' approach to formative assessment. You're going to use modeling metacognitive talk from metacognition. You want to work on your questioning, and you're particularly working on cold calling because you want more students in explicit instruction to be thinking more about what you're asking them to do and not just being lazy and waiting for a few kids to put up their hands. And so we want to go out and practice. We want to help them to do that. The second thing here, and we'll work a little bit more quickly through the back end of the process, obviously the prepare is everything, right? If you get the prepare right, team, you are off and racing, right? You are off and racing. And then once you're in there, you can hit the sprint. Annette, can I just check you've got my sprint slide up?
Yes, we have. And a couple of more comments, Simon, just before you go on, from Mrs. Torrey, who's delighted to have this fantastic resource to inspire initial discussions, that the Research Hub, and the process is so encouraging. And also Bev talking about linking with universities and how good that would be.
Yeah, well, some of them, I'll tell you, most education faculties are a big waste of time because they just write articles to each other in their own little sub-journals about things that aren't relevant all to practice. And they spend all their time critical theory this, sociology this, and look, it's all fine and there's a role for that, but we also need pragmatic academics who are asking questions driven by practice, who give you good enough evidence to make better decisions. And I think Education Endowment Foundation have stepped in really well. And I think the work of Steve Higgins out of Durham University, Professor Coe, Rob Coe, stunning work over the years. There's been a handful of people, to be honest, who've actually got on and produced things that are useful for you. So the second thing is you've got to sprint. If you're dedicating and buying out time for teachers to get together, if it doesn't result in practice, I hate to tell you that you're just investing in knowledge building. And that rarely does change things. I've got a lot of knowledge about how I shouldn't use my phone before bed, how I should move my body and use my finances. But to be honest, if I did everything that I know, I'd already be a billionaire with a six-pack. And the problem with educators is we often stop at the knowledge building, the good conversation, great conversation about practice, really rich, good stuff. What did you do about it in the last 4 weeks? Oh, well, you know, pretty busy. So we need to get into the sprinting, to the doing. And this is about finding a small part of our craft that we're going to step out of autopilot. We've all had an autopilot drive to and from work at some point where you can get to work and you say, who drove me here? It's a bit scary, isn't it? Well, so too in teaching, we can get into that fluency. So it's about stepping out, picking one thing you're working on, pushing beyond your comfort zone, making sure you're practicing a little bit. But remember, it's not overwhelming because you're just practicing one strategy or technique. Secondary teachers, I just say one strategy or technique in one of the classes that you teach. Just one. And make it manageable, make it small. Because what we argue in the book is that in order to improve, we've got to find opportunities to both do your craft, but intentionally practice your craft. Anyone else walking in would just say, oh, he's just teaching, but not for you. At that moment, you're not just teaching, you're also practicing your teaching. There's a small slice of your teaching that you're trying to get better at. And then we encourage teams to come together once for a little 15 to 20-minute check-in meeting where we ask, what have you done? Where are you stuck? And what are you going to do next? Lastly, humans aren't very good at learning from experience, especially when we're busy. And so we ask for a short 40-minute meeting for a review. We have a protocol for this online. And people come together to talk about what they did, the evidence of what occurred, and how they're going to incorporate what they've just done into their future practice. You see, this is kind of crazy, but you've really got to get it if you're going to understand my model here. I want students in 2025 to still be benefiting from the sprints that are done in your school in October 2021. How? Well, what I think we need to do is help people change one thing sustainably and then integrate it into their normal repertoire of how they teach. If your teachers learned something deeply, understood it, and integrated it, then it should become a regular habit of how they do their craft. So whoever they're teaching in 2025 should benefit from the change that they enabled over that first sprint in the new school year. This is a radical idea because what it says is that we can do much smaller amounts of change every term, that it adds up to much bigger sustainable shifts in expertise over time. If you like, you've been trying to do too much change over a short period of time and actually not getting much sustainable change over a long period of time. And my strategy counterintuitively says if you want big change over 3 to 4 years, help teachers just change 3 to 4 things a year that really matter, that are based on evidence, and help them do it in a sustainable way. So can I just ask you to put into the chat bar, what's one thing you kind of like or you appreciate about this teaching sprints approach to collaborative professional learning? What's one thing you say, well, that's a bit of a leading question, Simon, I don't like it very much. Well, you can also let me know that.
Simon, that's been really interesting while people are putting things in the chat pane. I'm just going to introduce my colleague, Alison. Alison, if you want to put your camera on too. Alison is our lead specialist who supports the Into Headship program as well. And I know you did some work with Into Headship, so she's going to follow on through with the rest of this session and have a finish up when we've gone through this chat session.
Great.
Thanks, Annette. I have to say, Simon, you know, the 7 universities that we work with in Into Headship are very valuable. Just feel I should say that. We have some Into Headship participants on the call today. But the whole idea of research and how we use it, I think, is I was so encouraged to see that sharing, because sometimes it can feel really hard to find. And I've been listening to you and making links to where we can find things in Scotland. So colleagues on the call, don't forget that within my GTCS, there's the whole research hub there as well. So that's an area that you can also find research articles that to inspire your thinking. I think this morning, some of the messages I'm going to take away, there are so many links and within our national model of professional learning. We have the key features, which includes collaboration and also includes inquiry. And what you're describing here is that inquiry, but it's so, in many ways, so simple and yet so powerful. And as Annette said, it's like eating the elephant one bite at a time, isn't it? It's finding those simple things that you can do quickly and just continuing to build on that, rather than making a big falderal and get tied up in fancy bits and fancy thing. Actually just start doing it. I think that's, for me, that's something that's really resonating this morning. I'm also interested, I don't know whether it's nearly your dinner time now, Simon, or whether it's us just after breakfast. There's lots of food references in there. So I heard you talk about sharing recipes and also if you don't, the other way of doing things is a bit like pedagogical dieting. So I picked up on some of that. So let's not be on that pedagogical diet, but share our recipes for success. So just looking in the chat pane, lots of feedback in here. Yeah. Exactly what I've said, just simple and easy to communicate, manageable, but it brings that rigor in. And I think we heard you talking about that very clearly. Action and accountability, not just discussion. And you're right, we're very good at talking in our staff rooms. And without very much effort, we can just push that to the next level. Yep, simplicity, evidence base, lots of resonating messages coming through this morning. And so I guess, colleagues, thinking from here today, whether you want to share in the chat pane or whether you just want to reflect for a few minutes and think about what's one action you're going to take away from today, from this session. So in terms of your own professional learning this morning, you might be sitting on your own, you might be at home, you might be in school, in your office. We've been hearing about that approach, that rigor. What is it you'll do with this piece of professional learning this morning? What will your action be from this? I think I could probably guess from some, well, Bev is now going to teach, so thanks, Bev. Rona is suggesting that she's going to use it next session for providing structure to the approach to professional learning. So there are already colleagues beginning to think about different things that they're going to do. Also, I liked when you spoke about, are we going to do things as we did in October 2019, or what might be different? What might change?
Thanks, Alison. I think we'll just hand back to Simon for the last words in the session.
Lots of great comments though, Simon. Really,
Yeah,
really
great.
great comments.
Great. Well, the first thing to say is you don't have to choose to decide it or not. I normally say move through a process of exploring, experimenting, and then expanding. So I'd encourage you to lean into any interest you have. Everything you need is free online. I will pitch the book because my publisher will be happy if I do. And I've just put in a link because my colleague and co-author, Bronwyn Ryrie Jones, and she helped us put together just to set a little book club questions. And so I could even imagine some of you just might want to get a couple of people to have a read, use some of those book club questions and just say, what do we think? Is there a there? And you could do, I mean, it's short. You could do this even in the coming month to explore. And then you could just say, well, look, could we get one team to have a play with this approach? Who's a team that would give it a good go? And do a little micro sprint and keep it simple. Just use one of the starters from Dylan or Tom or others. Like, don't make it so complex to begin with. It's amazing how many people I work with and I've designed a simple process and then they make it really complex. We've got to get the buy-in of our whole school and it's got to be lined up to the plan. I mean, just get a group of people getting moving, experiencing what works, being able to share that story. And then from there, you can build on that success over time. And then lastly, I always say, look, your first sprint's a bit like your first pancake. It never turns out all that well. People get a bit confused. They might have a good conversation, not follow through, or they follow through, but they don't collect evidence. Just get through 2 or 3 sprints before you make any big conclusions. It is one of those things that builds momentum. But the coolest thing is that once you implement it within your school, the next year, you don't have to get a whole new process. You can just change what it focuses on. So in the coming year, you might work on a lot of formative assessment. That might be a really good thing to work on as you work out where are students up to and what do they need next. The next year, you can use the same process and you might have a real focus on writing. And teachers love that it's the same improvement process, but with just a different practice focus. And that really reduces the change fatigue over the years.
Well, thank you so much, Simon. I think you've got a lot of people inspired and fired up this morning. And at this time of year, when people are so tired, that's not an easy thing to do. And I'm sure people have loved your laid back approach to this that isn't putting pressure on. It's just giving ideas and inspiration and ways that people can start to think a little differently. And that whole notion of systems leadership that's just about a little nudge, it's the same with improving practice, that mastery of experience, that practicing our craft. So we are indebted to you. You've done 2 sessions for us, given us of your time freely, and we are so grateful. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who's joined in this morning. 8 o'clock in the morning is a hard ask for people to jump in and start professional learning. So we really appreciate all of you being here today and hope that it's landed well with you. Thank you so very much. And good luck with your day ahead. Enjoy the work with the children and enjoy that next bit of planning. Alison's so right. What are you going to do now, even if it's just think to plan and make that a committed action? Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.
Don't forget to fill the evaluation form. That's the very
thanks,
first thing we're
Alison.
going to do.
I always forget.